The United Kingdom of Israel, lesson number 9, King Solomon's Apostasy. Here we see Solomon and calling down fire from heaven in the dedication of the temple. You can see the fire from God burning the sacrifice. So he knew God and experienced him. This is what the Bible said in 1 Kings 18 when Elisha called down fire. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burnt up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. So Solomon, at this point, was in with God. But later in life, you see Solomon with the god Molech. It says their sons and their daughters they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. This lesson, lesson number 9, is about how Solomon's idolatry represented an apostasy. An apostasy means that and the evil thing about an apostasy is an abandonment of one's faith, but yet you profess to still be in that faith. You can abandon your faith, that's backsliding, but to continue to believe you're with God, that is apostasy. After the death of King David, along comes his son, King Solomon. Pictured here, King Solomon was the third king of the United Kingdom of Israel, and he is the beginning of Israel's problems. Up to now, King Saul and King David never went into idolatry. Let's take a look at King Solomon's start. 2 Chronicles 6:12 through 21. Solomon's prayer of dedication. Now, I would like to say beforehand that Samuel's prophecy against having a king was that the kings would be selfish, make money. None of in his prophecy did I see where they would worship other gods. And just true to even saints' children today, most of the abominations of false religion has been brought in on the true religion by those who knew better and know better. 2 Chronicles 6:12 through 21, Solomon's prayer of dedication. So Solomon built the house David wanted built. Took 12 years. He built the house and built his house. And when the house was finished built, he dedicated the house to the Lord, the God of heaven. And here in 2 Chronicles 6:12, it says, Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands. For Solomon had made a bronze platform, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. And he had it set in the midst of the court. And he stood on it, knelt down on his knees before all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands toward heaven. And he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven or on earth like you. This is Solomon talking. Who keep your covenant and mercy with your servants, who walk before you with all their hearts. You have kept what you promised your servant David, my father. You have both spoken with your mouth and fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day. Therefore, the Lord God of Israel, now keep what you promised your servant David, my father, saying, You shall not fail to have a man sit before me on the throne of Israel. Only if your sons take heed to their way, that they walk in my law as you have walked before me. And now, O Lord God of Israel, let your word come true, which you have spoken to your servant David. Now this shows that Solomon understood God is with you, but he's with you on condition. The sons must take heed to their way, that they may walk in my law as you have walked before me. And he goes to verse 18 and he says, But will God indeed dwell with men on earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built? Yet regard the prayer of your servant and his supplication, O Lord my God, and listen to the cry and the prayer which your servant is praying before you, that your eyes may be open toward this temple day and night, toward the place where you said you would put your name, that you may hear the prayer which your servant makes toward this place. And may you hear the supplications of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. So Solomon is praying for forgiveness. He's praying for cleansing, and he's praying for God's presence to just be with them at all times, continually. He said, I know this temple can't contain you. This shows that he understood that God is the God of light that illumes all space. He had a very perfect knowledge of the God of heaven, undoubtedly taught to him by his father. So Israel should have been set. They should have been straight. And how did God accept the prayer? Well, 2 Chronicles 7, 1-4, God's response to Solomon's prayer, it says, when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And the priest could not enter the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. When all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshiped and praised the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Then the king and all the people offered sacrifices before the Lord. They offered sacrifices, and God signaled his approval by burning the sacrifice, consuming the burnt offering. A burnt offering is for forgiveness. A burnt offering is for atonement. A burnt offering puts you at one with God. So at this point, God, through Solomon and the children of Israel, have a great start. This is a better start than David, who had to run from Saul all his life. This is a better start than Ishbosheth, who just was a vassal king that was being controlled by Abner and those. This is a better start than Saul, who on his first endeavor disobeyed God. This is God at one with the man, Solomon. But God warned Solomon about the foreigners and said, the foreigners are going to mess with you to get you to worship other gods. Don't let them turn your heart. And in the 32nd verse, when he was dedicating the temple, Solomon said this about the foreigners. Moreover, concerning a foreigner who is not of your people, Israel, but has come from a far country for the sake of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when they come and pray in this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, that they may know that this temple which I have built is called by your name. So he's not expecting us to worship the gods of the foreigners. He's saying, Lord, I want the foreigners to come to you and bow to you and understand you, that you're the only God, that there is no God. This is 2 Chronicles 6:14. And he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven or on earth like you. No God like you. That was such a great story about King Solomon that in this series on returning to Zion, we wouldn't have to return if it wasn't for this page here. If it wasn't for the events that followed when Solomon got old, we would not have to return to Zion from captivity. Here's what happened to Solomon. King Solomon's apostasy. Here he is old, worshiping idols. Let's read it. Solomon was the third and the last king of the United Kingdom of Israel, following King Saul and King David. He was the son of David and Bathsheba, the former wife of Uriah the Hittite, whom David had killed to hide his adultery with Bathsheba while her husband was on the battlefront. Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon, the book of Ecclesiastes, and much of the book of Proverbs. His authorship of Ecclesiastes is contested by some, but Solomon is the only son of David to be king over Israel, not just Judah, in Jerusalem. Ecclesiastes 1 and 1, 1 and 12. And many of the descriptions of the author fit Solomon perfectly. Solomon reigned, as did David, and as did Saul, for about 40 years. When he ascended to the throne, Solomon sought after God, and God gave him opportunity to ask for whatever he wanted. Solomon humbly acknowledged his inability to rule well and unselfishly asked God for the wisdom he would need to rule God's people justly. God gave him wisdom and wealth. Besides, 1 Kings 3, 4, and 15. Chapter 10, verse 27. In fact, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. 1 Kings 10, 23. God also gave Solomon peace on all sides during most of his reign. 1 Kings 4, 20 through 25. Yes, with all that wisdom and with the power of God, and the enemies heard how God burnt the sacrifice and the Ark of the Covenant, they were not going to attack Israel. Israel was safe and secure from all alarms. But here's the problem. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of them foreigners, who led him into public idolatry in his old age, greatly angering God. 1 Kings 11, 1 through 13. 1 Kings 11, 9 through 10 records, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. God told Solomon that he would remove the kingdom from him, but for the sake of David, he would not do so during Solomon's lifetime. He also promised not to tear the whole kingdom away. In the meantime, God raised up adversaries against Solomon who caused trouble the remainder of Solomon's life. 1 Kings 11, 14 through 25. Jeroboam, who would become the first king of Israel, also began to rebel against Solomon, but fled. 1 Kings 11, 26, 40. The kingdom was divided under Rehoboam, Solomon's son, who became the first king of Judah. 1 Kings chapter 12. King Solomon's apostasy manifested itself in idolatry. So let's look at King Solomon's idolatry in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, and also, by the way, told Solomon specifically, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. Here we see Ashtoreth with the big breasts, the fertility god, with all those skeletons and souls underneath her skirt. Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. And Milcom, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Here we see Milcom holding her breast, and she's the abomination of the Ammonites. So as you can see, two different idols, but really accentuating and emphasizing the same thing, sex. All right, so that is the detestable god of the Ammonites named Milcom. Verse 6, so Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place For Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, he built a high place for this detestable god, Chemosh, with the many different heads, the many different symbols. He built a high place. Remember, this is the one who God spoke with twice, appeared to him, and he burned the sacrifice after Solomon's prayer. All right. And then the one says, verse number 7, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites, they passed their children through the fire. The god Molech is an abomination of the Ammonites. It is considered an abomination, that god, because this is where they offered the babies of the child prostitutes and others as idols. They sacrificed their sons and daughters, make them walk through the fire of Molech. Samuel, or Solomon rather, worshipped these. Solomon worshipped these. And he did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Molech worship included sexual worship of Ashtoreth. Milcom worship also included sexual worship. The sexual relationship between these false gods set an example for unbridled sex or unbridled sensuality among their worshipers. All these gods are the same. Anal sex between male and male worshipers and male and female worshipers was viewed as an offering to the goddess. Some 1450 years after Leviticus, the Apostle Paul references pagan worship in Romans 1:26-27 when he blasts the same kind of fertility goddess worship in the first century Rome. And that last part of the verse says, and so Solomon did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. He forgot that he had wished for the foreigners to come in the temple and worship God. He forgot that he understood that Israel and the truth was the leading religion and the leading source of salvation for all mankind, for all of God's creation. He forgot that. And so for his foreign wives, they didn't have to come to the temple. They were able to worship their gods. And their gods, Solomon started off building high places. He ended up worshiping them himself and burning incense to them. That is King Solomon's apostasy and idolatry.